One other question, Matthew. How would you assess the weakness or strength of Jemaah Islamiyah now?
I don't claim to be an expert on Jemaah Islamiyah, but I think the trend is showing that they're having more difficulty recruiting. I'm a big proponent to say that the end of this conflict, which we don't talk about often, what does the end of this conflict look like? Well, let's take models of other conflicts. Take, for instance, the battle against insurgency in the Philippines against communism. It was a battle that took place from the 1950s to the late 1980s. It was eventually solved through law enforcement techniques, government incentives, economic incentives, amnesty program for fighters. And we consider that a success. The government of the Philippines now controls the problem because there's still 8,000 members of the communist organization in the Philippines. It's not a zero-sum game. And so what I would say is for Jemaah Islamiyah, the recruiting is on a downward trend. And that's what I consider to be winning the war, to get that down to a number where it's managed by law enforcement.
Great.
Hi, Eric Goldstein, Human Rights Watch. Can you address the factor of time in discussing various techniques? Because the approach that you described, which seems admirable, seems appropriate for situations where you have a little bit of time to play with in order to get the information that you want. How often is it the case that you need information in 10 minutes? And how often is it the case you need it in 2 days? Or how often is it that you want information over the course of a week or two? And how does that affect the techniques that you describe?
Yeah, one of my favorite questions, the ticking time bomb scenario. I mean, what do American detectives do when they're dealing with gangs and they interrogate, catch somebody and they interrogate him, knowing that if they don't get information very quickly, that person's dealer or supplier is going to move, knowing that they're captured? We dealt with this every day in Iraq, especially when we were hunting down Zarqawi and the leaders behind the suicide bombings. The first guy I described in my book that we interrogated, Abu Ali, had been captured literally 15 minutes after blessing suicide bombers to go out and kill people. And if gotten there 15 minutes earlier, could have saved hundreds of lives. We dealt with that every single day in Iraq. We consistently captured guys who knew where future attacks were going to take place. If you could argue that enhanced interrogation techniques work and they're effective, would we have used them? My answer is no. If I knew that torture was effective 100% of the time, I wouldn't have used it. Why? Because every one of us in that prison where we handled foreign fighters listened day in and day out. Foreign fighters say that the reason they came to Iraq to fight was because of the pictures of Abu Ghraib and knowing what happened at Guantanamo Bay. Some people say, well, what about the fact that we've been attacked before that happened? It's not a matter of are there people that will attack us. There always will be. The last 4 presidencies, we've always endured terrorist attacks. It's a matter of levels. Numerous additional fighters were recruited because of torture and abuse of Muslim prisoners. And so everyone in my prison realized even if torture did work 100% of the time, even if it worked half the time, we would never use it. One, because we'd just be recruiting for the enemy. And that's not some amazing discovery that we came across. It's been in the Army Field Manual since at least 1949. That if you use torture and abuse, the enemy is going to use that to recruit new fighters. So that's not a revelation. But we also realized that that's what we were fighting against. That this war isn't just about stopping terrorist attacks, it's about preserving American principles. So, but let me say this also about the ticking time bomb scenario. If my mother was on the bus with the bomb that was going to go off and I had 15 minutes to get the info, I wouldn't turn to torture. That would actually be the last technique. Because every technique works on somebody. What we're talking about is the probability of a technique working. Torture, as we know from 183, if you have to use a technique 183 times, it's not working and it's not efficient. I would refer, what I did in the field when we had to get information very quickly is I went to law enforcement techniques. I went to prisoner's dilemma. I went to those type of techniques that police have been using for decades in that same scenario. Because they give you the best probability of success.
What are the outer limits of what you can do with the Army Field Manual? What's the most you can do?
So the Army Field Manual, which I believe is actually a very valid and great document for interrogation techniques, but it's never been scientifically studied. We're just now starting that. Colonel Kleinman, Steve Kleinman, who's one of our most experienced interrogators, is working with researchers to evaluate the techniques as they're being used. But the field manual will allow you, and there's a line in there that says you can use psychological tricks, ruses, and ploys that allow you to use, that line allows you to use law enforcement techniques. People say, well, the Army Field Manual outlaws law enforcement techniques. That's not true at all. You can legally use law enforcement techniques under the Army Field Manual, and they're non-coercive. And we've been using them. The problem is the only people who are using them are those people who have law enforcement experience backgrounds. There are gray areas in interrogations. I'll give you a perfect example. In fact, this just came up recently. You can't threaten a detainee. We all know that. And I think that includes indirect threats. But can you make a statement of fact? If a detainee, if you catch a detainee making bombs, suicide bombs, can you show them the Iraqi Penal Code, which states that the punishment for participating in suicide bombing operations is death? That is a statement of fact. That's the law. You can do that in a U.S. criminal interrogation. I heard a proponent of waterboarding last night on live television say that we can't tell somebody that the punishment for a crime is death in an intelligence interrogation according to Army Field. That's wrong. I had detainees ask me, what is the punishment for my crimes? That's not a threat. That's a statement of fact. That's very different than a scenario where you tell a detainee, if you don't cooperate, I'm going to put your face on a poster that says you cooperate with the U.S. forces and I'm going to post it in your village, and you can guess what's going to happen after that. That's a threat to him and his family, knowing that Al-Qaeda will conduct reprisal killings. So what's my standard for these gray areas? The golden rule. If I would consider it torture or abuse, or what is actually the minimum standard, which is cruel and inhumane, degrading treatment, would I use it if it was being used against my own troops? And that's my bottom line.
Matthew, how much do you think this is still going on? Enhanced interrogation techniques. I mean, what do you think is the bottom line?
I think we've learned from our mistakes, but I think there is still a resistance within the intelligence and interrogations community over what the law says and what people should be allowed to do. The Army Field Manual still allows us to separate people indefinitely in solitary confinement. It still allows us to put people through sleep deprivation. It doesn't even prohibit stress positions. So I would say that we can say now that we don't torture people, but I'm not confident that we can say that we're meeting the minimum standard, which is humane treatment. But let me add one more thing to that, which is you have to realize that the large majority of interrogators would never torture or abuse somebody even if they were left alone in a room with a detainee and there were no rules and nobody was watching. And then there's a very small amount, let's call it 5%, of people who would do it with the rules, with supervision. Because there's a criminal element to every population. We know that. It's that middle group of people, that middle 30%, 20% of interrogators who would do it if there wasn't a rule or correct supervision. And that's what we're trying to target. Okay.
Back.